Welcome to video number 7 in this Dispy primer on Christian nationalism. And I'm doing a trio of videos on Dispies and New Testament priority. And this first video here is on the cultural mandate, which I've already covered in a previous video, kind of by way of introduction. And I want to address it in a little bit more depth in this video. Now, just by way of reminder, the cultural mandate goes back to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, where God commands Adam and Eve to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And that word for fill doesn't show up again until Genesis 6, when the earth is in fact filled. And there we read that the earth is filled with violence. And then the cultural mandate is restated to Noah after he comes off the ark to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. So we see that the cultural mandate was binding pre-fall. It is binding post-flood. And one of the things that I think we fail to realize in contemporary dispensationalism is that the cultural mandate is in fact being carried out today. It's not a matter of whether or not it's being carried out. It is in fact being carried out, and I think we just don't realize it. Matter of fact, it's important to go back to Genesis, and I've done a couple sermons on this, but if you go back to Genesis 4 and you look at Cain's line, there's actually a really fascinating section there on the fallen line carrying out the cultural mandate. We see that Cain and his progeny begin the process of urbanization, building a city, and then we see specialized labor, specialized professions, and from there we start to see the arts developed with musical instruments, and we see metal tools being developed, and even probably some weapons, and then we finally see some poetry with Lamech. And so what that helps us to understand is that all people, by design, are carrying out the cultural mandate. Now, in the last video, I looked at the John MacArthur, Dick Mayhew systematic theology textbook. You guys might know it, The Big White Whale. And I noted a concluding paragraph there, page 449. In sum, God created culture. He made a diverse world, tasked man to rule and subdue it for his glory. There's no dichotomy between God and culture or man and culture. God expects man to successfully rule over his creation. Psalm 8, 4 through 8. Although the complete fulfillment of this expectation awaits Jesus' kingdom in, quote, the world to come, Hebrews 2, 5 through 8. So it is the position of this particular systematic theology textbook that this is still binding and applicable today. And there they define the cultural mandate in part to include works, art, music, education, and all areas where man interacts with his environment. Now, I also want to just note a little section from Dr. Michael Vlock's book, He Will Reign Forever, A Biblical Theology of the Kingdom of God. Exceptional book. I highly recommend it. But Dr. Vlock notes that in relationship to Revelation 21, verses 24 through 26, where we see that in glory there are still nations, there are still kings, meaning there's still civil government, even in a glorified state. It's not, therefore, just a necessary evil. It's actually something that continues into eternity. But there, Dr. Vlock notes, he says, in regarding those texts in Revelation, twice it is stated that the nations will bring their, quote, glory into the New Jerusalem. This, quote, glory probably refers to cultural contributions. There is no need here to limit glory simply to the nations bringing themselves with no reference to their wealth. Both are in view here. We're not told what these contributions are, but they probably involve the best these nations have to offer regarding wealth, art, music, architecture, agriculture, etc. As Hoekema states, quote, is it too much to say that, according to these verses, the unique contributions of each nation to the life of the present earth will enrich the life of the new earth? End quote. Vlock continues, these contributions include, quote, and he's citing Hoekema again, the best products of culture and art which this earth has produced. So what this helps us to understand is that It's not outside the dispensational camp to understand that the cultural mandate, number one, is binding pre-fall and post-fall and post-flood, and it's also going to be continued on into the eternal state. So, what should we be doing now? Well, as I've said, Genesis 4 chronicles the carrying out of the cultural mandate amongst the fallen line as Cain's line engages in some of the specialized skills in developing instruments and musical instruments and metal instruments. And so I think what we need to consider here as it relates to the cultural mandate, number one, it's binding. Number two, it is in fact being played out. And this is what's really key. All of mankind is carrying out the cultural mandate. They're doing it by design, right? Children, you don't have to teach them to do this. They just start building with blocks and they start coloring things. They beautify and they create, and they also destroy too, right? That's that fallen nature. But children just naturally begin to beautify and to build. And so all of mankind is carrying out the cultural mandate. And here's what's happened. I think in particularly contemporary American culture, we've checked our anthropology at the door. We have forgotten just how depraved and wicked unbelievers are. And we've really just kind of sat back, sat on our hands, and really not engaged intentionally in the cultural mandate. Well, guess what? Satan's seed hasn't been doing that. So at the end of the day, there's only two lines of people on the earth. There's the sons of God and there's the sons of the devil. And the sons of the devil are carrying out the will of their father, who was a liar and a murderer from the beginning. And so, as Ephesians 2 would tell us, they walk according to the prince of the power of the air. He is animating them. This liar and murderer is animating them in their behaviors. And now, by nature, they're carrying out the cultural mandate to the glory of their spiritual father, who is a liar and a murderer. And so what's happening then is they are engaged in arts and economics and politics and education. And we need to think about this. All these cultural aspects are tied to worldview. They're the outworking of a worldview, and particularly arts and education and politics. Not only are they the product of a worldview, they also seek to reinforce that worldview or even advance that worldview. So they are actively involved in creating all of these cultural tools for the purpose of glorifying their spiritual father, whether they realize it or not, and for the purpose of solidifying that unbelieving, murderous, lying worldview. That's what they're doing. And they have been doing this. And so we can stop and even pause. How is it that, and without getting into the weeds here, how is it that things like critical race theory and DEI have integrated into every facet of society, whether it's healthcare, whether it's banking, whether it's commerce, you name it, whether it's higher education, DEI, CRT, they have integrated everywhere. That's because the unbelievers have been carrying out the cultural mandate. They have been seeking to get their hands on the levers of power to propagate their worldview and to destroy the opposing worldview. And Christians, by and large, we've been sitting on our hands, not even maybe aware that we have this obligation to carry out the cultural mandate, while all of our enemies are actively engaging in it, and they have taken over the world. And we've not even noticed it happening. If you think back 5 years ago, you didn't have any Christians sounding the alarm about CRT and DEI getting into healthcare, getting into higher education, getting into banking, getting into every industry. We didn't hear anybody sounding the alarm. We just weren't paying attention. And I think this really ties back to the cultural mandate. Now, what happens is the Great Commission then comes in and it subsumes the cultural mandate. You see, we don't need this New Testament priority that pretends that nothing in the Old Testament is applicable or binding or helpful for us. No. You see, we are to be carrying out the cultural mandate. We're to be creating these works, however God has created us, that glorify God, that press out a biblical worldview, a Christian worldview. And then the Great Commission comes along and informs us in how to do it to the glory of Christ. We were doing it to the glory of our spiritual father before, but now God has transferred us from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his beloved Son. And now we are to be carrying out that cultural mandate to the glory of Christ in an explicitly Christian way, whether it's higher education, lower education, economics, the arts, the sciences, healthcare, you name it. It is to be explicitly Christian. And so not every Christian is called to go out on the mission field. That's not exactly what the Great Commission calls for. What it calls for is for us to be engaged in proclaiming the gospel to those around us and then discipling everybody around us. And particularly using the Old Testament, not just the New, right? So when Jesus says, in Matthew 28, baptizing them and teaching them all that I've commanded you. That's going to include all of the Old Testament. Now we have to principalize it, but what we got to understand is that the cultural mandate is not only binding, but it's being carried out right now to this day. And as we've been kind of, singing "We Are the World" and group hug, the unbelievers have been actively involved in carrying out the cultural mandate, and they've been very effective at infiltrating every facet of society and getting their hands on all the levers of power. And who's better qualified to govern our neighbors, believer or unbeliever, than the Christian? So think about that, and hopefully that's helpful.